Welcome to Sunflower Movement. I am your host, Ashley Buckner. Before we get started, here's a quick disclaimer. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. I am a licensed therapist, but unless you have a signed consent form with me, I am not your therapist. This platform is not a form of psychotherapy, counseling, or healthcare of any kind. Sunflowers bloom in the most unexpected places, and they adjust to remain connected to the sun. Metaphorically, I define these sunflower movements as experiences with people, places, and moments where we feel seen, heard, and believed. Thank you for tuning in. Hi, everyone. I am so excited for today's episode with my therapist friend, Leah Aguirre. She is a licensed clinical social worker in San Diego, California, and she specializes in helping people heal from emotional abuse. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today. I have so many questions that I received from the audience and from the community that we're going to dive into. But before we do that, I'm just going to have Leah introduce herself. So welcome, Leah.
I'm so excited to be here because we've connected for a while and I've loved the work you're doing. So I'm excited because I think I mentioned I have a few clients that overlap with my work and your work. And so it's going to be super beneficial. But I'm Leah. So I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm based in California, and I am a co-founder of Cove Counseling Group. I've been a therapist for, over 10 years now, licensed for like 7 or 8. But how I got into this specific niche of emotional abuse is I did a lot of trauma work with youth and young adults experiencing homelessness that were in abusive situations at home. So a lot of child abuse, sexual abuse. And so that became something I was really familiar with, comfortable with, love the work. I'm trained in EMDR, which is a evidence-based practice to help you process unhealed trauma, similar to brain spotting. And with like the niche that I had for a few years, people reaching out to me for processing unhealed trauma, like we found, they're in these abusive dynamics as an adult, especially emotionally abusive dynamics. And that makes sense because a lot of folks that are in emotionally abusive dynamics have a history of trauma or attachment related wounds. So it became kind of this very specific niche of a population that I'm working with. And then, I've struggled with OCD, anxiety, self-worth throughout my life. A few years ago, I did EMDR myself as a client, loved it. And I was already doing it as a practitioner and using it. But as a client, I was like, I really bought into the sauce. I was like, this is it. So I got really excited about that. And then previously I was in an emotionally abusive dynamic. And the thing about emotional abuse is oftentimes, and we'll talk more about it, is it's really subtle. And I think I'm fortunate to be a therapist and mental health professional and understand kind of the nuance of abusive dynamics. So it took me longer probably than I wanted to, but I was able to figure it out fairly quickly that this relationship was harmful to me. And I think with that is why I wrote this book that I have coming out in spring. Is this really love? Because it's so easy to get caught up in these dynamics. I experienced it firsthand. I have so many clients who have been immersed in these relationships where they're like, it doesn't feel great, but it's not really abuse. And I say that in quotes. Like, they're like, we just argue all the time. And when you really tease it all out, there's something a little bit more funky than I think they're aware of. And so anyways, so it's both like my lived experience, my professional experiences, and then really I sought trainings for it. I have really immersed myself in this world and I love it. And I don't love abuse, but I think bringing awareness to it's so important because it's normalized a lot, right? And I think in the population you serve and are working with, especially, it's like some of these things are so normalized that you don't even see it for what it is. Like, you're so in it that you don't have the perspective and objectivity. So like my role as a therapist, right? I'm not going to ever tell someone to leave, but I will help them gain that perspective and do some psychoeducation. So yeah, that's kind of about me. And it's become that's been my primary focus. And also dating after abuse. So dating after you've been in an abusive dynamic too. What does that look like? How can you trust yourself? That's a lot of the work I do too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Leah. And I already have some things coming up. I think one, what really connected us, because we connected on Instagram like a while ago, like you said.
Hmm.
And I just remember every time you would share some insight about emotionally abusive relationships, I was like, this just really feels so similar to a lot of the dynamics that are happening in high control religion. And I was often taking like religion and putting it where you had relationship on so many of your posts, like in terms of how I was reflecting on it. And it just feels so relevant and so intertwined,
Yeah.
that I think it's going to be a really helpful conversation to have today for a lot
Yeah.
of people listening, and just your level of expertise. And what I also love is like, you are not affiliated with this high control religion, right?
No.
At all. So you have like no, I mean, aside, you can share what you know about Mormonism. And obviously, this podcast isn't just about Mormonism, but that's obvious. I live in Utah. I'm a practicing therapist in Utah. So that's the
Hmm.
clientele that I see.
Yeah.
A lot of clients that are impacted by the Mormon church. But I just love having other people who have not been immersed in this culture, because I think they get to offer like this bird's eye view. And it's just what,
Yes.
as what you were saying, when you're in an abusive dynamic, and I would say especially in a most emotionally abusive dynamic, you're not aware so much of what's
Mm-mm.
happening. It's really hard to see, and sometimes it takes kind of like zooming out to understand fully what's happening.
Totally, because I mean, there's so many aspects where if you witnessed abuse between your own parents or adults in your life as a kid, that's normalized, right? So, like, oh, this is what a relationship looks like. Even if you don't like what it looks like, it doesn't feel good. You're like, this is normal. Like, this is acceptable behavior, right? Or this is like, and this is very gendered, but like, oh, men do this. This is what men do, right? I hear that a lot. Like, boys will be boys. This is just a man. And I'm like, this isn't just a man. This is abusive behavior. And I mean, part of it is our culture and society and like this. I mean, I could get on my like feminist soapbox, but like this culture we've created so that women are seen as being less than or needing to submit to their male partner. So this is very gendered. I work with all folks in, you know, variety of situations, gender identities, types of relationships. But I think the thing is like it's you're coerced. Well, so I'm like a high demand religion, right? Because I do work with a lot of folks that have like former Mormons or Jehovah's Witness or other very kind of cult like Christian sects.
Yeah.
Um, you are coerced at a really young age to really just submit to the culture. And that's very similar to relationships. Like you don't go into a relationship. I always say this, like thinking it's going to be abusive. You don't go into it being like, this is the partner I want, the one that's going to abuse me, treat me like shit, and make me feel like, like
Mhm.
like less than. You go into it being like very optimistic. Usually they bait you. They are kind and charismatic and they attune to you and where you're at and so then you're like hooked and you feel good and or there's a familiarity and then that's when the abuse behavior starts to really play a part in the relationship is like once they know that there's an attachment, these people think they can get away with everything. And so it's really coercive and nuanced and manipulative. And I think that's the piece that we aren't educated about, like as kids, right? Like we talk about like consent in school. I mean, for most of us, right? But like just these relationships as being very black and white, like people are mean or people are not mean, like they're kind. And that's not how it works necessarily,
Yeah.
especially in adult relationships.
No, and I think you bring up such a good point, and I talk about this so much in my work with clients. When you are born and into a religion, right? It's essentially like your consent is taken away in a lot of ways because you're programmed and told this is what you believe,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is very difficult to see it for what it is, because this is just how it's always been, you
It's an
know?
echo chamber too, right? If your parents
Yes.
are this way, same thing with like relationships. So if your parents were in a tumultuous or toxic relationship and you're in this relationship, it's like, and they're not going to necessarily be like, this is abusive. They might be like, that's not great, or like, that's just how, that's just how it is. So you're in this echo chamber where everyone's just essentially validating that this is normal when
Yeah.
it's, yeah, when it might be normal to your family culture, but it's not
Sure.
okay. It's not safe. So like, I guess too, it's like, I guess the normalization meaning like it's just been ingrained that that's the status quo, right? That you have to be in this type of dynamic or that's what it is to be in a relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I say this a lot is like in high control religion, in Mormonism, there is so many behaviors that are normalized that are actually not I would say normal, right? Or developmentally appropriate.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think that's kind of also what you're getting to. Okay,
Mhm.
I'm really excited to dive into this, and I think this conversation is so needed for not only like the population I serve, but just for anyone who is struggling with maybe what they perceive or they're not sure what an emotionally abusive relationship is. So I am just going to jump into the questions. And the first
Perfect.
question, we're going to define what emotional abuse is. So the first question is, how do you even know if you are being emotionally abused? And then I would also just like, would you define what emotional abuse is too?
Yeah.
After this question.
Yes. So emotional abuse is any non-physical act or behavior that is intended to inflict emotional pain or diminish another person's self-worth and self-esteem. So it's any action, right? And again, like the abuser, for example, may not think I'm abusing this person, but they will take jabs. They will criticize you with the intention of like inflicting pain, of making you doubt yourself, of trying to challenge you in a way that's not kind and constructive. So it's really this intentional act of inflicting pain and trying to diminish your partner's worth.
That is such a solid definition. So I'm going to encourage people to rewind and re-listen if they like want to better understand what that means.
Yeah.
And then how would you say like to, and this is such a hard question because I think it's very subjective, but how would you answer, like, how do you even know if you're being emotionally abused? Like, what would be some, maybe like even some symptoms within the body that people might feel or
Yeah.
emotions?
And I talk about this a lot. It's like before we get into the actual behavior of your partner, I always ask my clients to focus on how they feel in the relationship. And that might seem like obvious, but like a few questions is like, how do you feel in the physical presence of your partner? Do you feel like you're walking on eggshells? Do you feel tense? Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you feel uneasy? Like, how do you feel? And also, like, on the other hand, how do you feel when you're away from this partner? Do you feel scared? Like, or do you feel like like you're doing something wrong? Do you feel like you are, like betraying them? Like, what is coming up when you're away from this partner? And just the various scenarios. So I do that with my clients, like, okay, so how is it like when you two argue or get into a disagreement? Because that's normal and a normal part of a relationship, right? But if you feel like scared or you feel so much shame, that's an indicator that you don't feel safe with this person. So really focusing on the emotions. I also the physical body. I did I did a reel about this because when I was in my abusive dynamic, it might be too much information, but like it was so obvious after I was like, I had so many digestive issues, like, and I'm not that person. Everything flows real well for me typically. It was backed up. I was like, had like the runs. It was like I was constantly like, it just was I was out of sorts. I had chronic stress headaches. And I know for me, that's what happens when I'm in a not great situation. I had a work situation years ago where I was constantly stressed and I had those headaches on a regular basis. And I even had migraines too with this person. Um, and I definitely lost some weight too because of the stress.
Yeah.
So I also encourage you to figure out like what's going on with your physical health.
Mhm.
Also, are you feeling fatigued? Are you feeling like fatigued? Are you isolating from other people? Do you feel like you just can't like be yourself? Like it feels like these questions might feel like obvious, but I think the thing is when you're in these relationships, you don't tune in and they don't want you to tune in. They don't want you to pause and really be like, what's going on with me? Because when you're in this constant state of crisis, like crisis management with this partner, you're not really tuning in to the things you need to tune into, which is like your body, how you're feeling emotionally. Are you spending time with your friends like you used to? Like, what's different? So I always tell people to like, what's different from when you first met this person to now?
Yeah.
So those are some questions like how to cue into your like to really do that inner like focus on the inner experience and doing a lot of self-reflection and really focusing on before and after I met this person.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know I'm going to keep bringing this back to high
Yeah.
control religion, but
But
this is
that's
why I'm
yeah.
so drawn to your work, Leah, because the whole time it's like these are also really great questions to evaluate your relationship with your religion, right? And
Mhm.
so I would
Mhm.
really invite listeners to tune into that also because I think it applies to a relationship, but also any entity, right? Any system, whether that be work, whether that be with your partner, your
Yeah.
religion, right? You know, it it's so important we tune into how do these relationships make us feel? How do we feel when we're with them, when we're not with them? All the things you just said. So I think such a great way to evaluate. And our psychosomatic symptoms are so incredibly real, right? And what comes up for me too, that is your nervous system's way of getting your
Mhm.
attention,
I was
right?
also say you're right, like getting sick all the time. That's another one, right? Because if you're in this hyper state and you're like your sympathetic nervous system's like, overactive, like you don't have your same immunosuppressants. Like you are more likely to get sick. And that also was something that I would say, like, it was a sign for me, what I've seen with clients. I know, and like, I'm not a medical provider, right? But I'm sure you've seen this in your clientele, a lot of chronic pain where they're like, we don't know where
Mhm.
this comes from. And we're not, and it's like, it's a fine line to balance because we don't want to blame you for your physical health symptoms, but our body, if we're not aware emotionally what's going on, our body is going to take the hit. And then we can really honestly just tuning into your body. That's what honestly cued me in when I was like, oh, I'm really unhappy. Like my whole body's shutting down. I don't
Yeah.
like this.
No, I mean, it's so valid. And I think the other caveat to this, and I noticed this a lot with people kind of navigating like a faith transition or deconstruction. One way so many people survive high control religion is by disembodiment, right? But that doesn't mean that you're not having physical symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just invite people to be curious if you do have some chronic pain or digestive issues, right? All of the things we've
Mm-hmm.
talked about. Could this be in part to the environment or the relationship that you are in? So,
Yeah. And
okay,
I've
I think,
noticed, like, I
oh,
don't
go
know,
ahead.
sorry, really quick. I don't know if you
No.
noticed with the brain spotting with EMDR, and it's just like I've noticed too, there's a shift and like there's less pain or there's less tension in the shoulders, or they notice
Yes.
like they don't have that pit in their stomach, right? So like doing this work and clearing some of that trauma or like processing it and holding space for that, you get the symptoms usually dissipate.
Oh my gosh, yes. That's one of my favorite things with brain spotting is a lot of times we will just target the physical symptoms that are surfacing,
Mm-hmm.
right, in the nervous system and just the release that so many clients have. I mean, myself personally, I have always had digestive issues in my
Mm.
stomach, like always. And it is remarkable, like the last 2.5 years of doing so many brain spotting sessions, how like the foods I can eat more food, like I'm more regular. It's just, and that's all I've done different is brain
Yeah.
spotting and
Yeah.
releasing the trauma from my nervous system, which is just so cool. I feel like we could spend the whole,
Yeah. I
the
know. I
whole
know.
podcast talking about this. Okay, we're gonna move on. Okay, this is another submission that came in. Is denying your experience emotional abuse? What about my partner telling me I can't talk about certain topics? Could you list different ways emotional abuse can happen?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. Not great, but great question. Cause I know, I was like, that's not great. Yeah, so, like, there's some phrases that are, like, pop psychology now that I really, really don't love, like gaslighting, but that's an example of gaslighting, right? Where you can't deny how someone feels because you feel how you feel, right? Like, if your feeling state is individual, like, it's unique to you. It's your perception of an experience. So regardless of your partner and if they can understand it or not, your feelings are your feelings. So, I to, like, stifle someone's feelings or invalidate your feelings that can be emotionally abusive. I think there's a difference and it's very nuanced where sometimes partners won't understand how you're feeling. They're like, "How did me texting you a couple hours late like make you feel like I don't care?" Right? Like they don't understand it. So there's a difference between someone not understanding and someone being like, "That's stupid. You shouldn't feel this way." And so I think if your partner is being like, is being condescending, is minimizing how you feel, is not open to understanding how you feel, that can be an indicator of abuse.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think that those are really important things to talk about. And I agree with you, like gaslighting gets so overused, but I
Yeah.
think it's very important to identify when it is relevant,
Right.
right?
And the intention, right? Like if someone's intentionally denying your experience and there's like the intent, again, intent and impact, like there's a lot of conversations about that. But if their goal is to invalidate you and really like change the narrative, that's abusive and manipulative, right? Versus if someone's really like, I don't understand, because that happens with partners. You're like, okay, like I didn't text you, but like I'm here, like, I love you. Like, right, like there's a
Yes.
difference.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I really love that you're pointing out that difference too. I think that's a super helpful thing to reflect on.
Hmm.
Okay, we're going on to the next submission. We're just going to get through
Okay.
as many of these as we can.
Okay.
Father was highly emotionally, among other things, abusive. Mormon church, obviously. I married someone who was what also was is and used the church as the main weapon in the abuse, even when I was still all in. Nothing was ever enough. This lasted about 20 years, with the
Mm,
last 7 being 10 times worse since I left the church. Question is, I struggle so much to find a shred of safety, desire, trust, or connection with my spouse now. I'm bearing myself up trying to make it happen, but my body just won't allow it. I feel broken. I feel like I shut down and burned out a long time ago through all of this. Is this normal? We're separating now, and all I can do is spin in circles mentally, trying to force myself to quote unquote make it work and
mm,
try any last ditch effort to want it. I just don't, and I'm heartbroken. Is this what prolonged emotional abuse does? I just first like I when I get submissions like this, I just always like to just really acknowledge and say
yeah.
thank you for sharing, and thank you for
Yeah.
vulnerability and authenticity, because this is hard
Yeah.
stuff. So I just want to add that before
Yeah.
we dive
No,
in.
it's you with these types of dynamics too, like you I have a couple of thoughts. So the first thought was like, if you're again, like there's a lot of insight there, right? Like my father was abusive. This is how my father was. You marry someone that's probably familiar, not because you want to marry your father, but you're like, this is what a husband does. This is how a spouse acts. So you choose like your partner, your life partner, under the guise that this is what it's supposed to be. So that's huge. I was gonna say with this question of like, is this normal? And I guess I hate that word normalcy. I always reframe it with clients and it's like, okay, regardless of what's normal and okay or not okay, like, can you live like this? Like, is this good for your soul? Can you thrive
Mhm.
in this relationship? Can you just be in this relationship? Like, regardless of other people's expectations or what's been, programmed in your family or in the church, does this feel good for you? Because what I'm hearing is you're not like you're suffering, right? And we don't get to choose our parents, we don't get to choose our family, but we get to choose our partners. Of course, if you're in like raised in this religion, you don't always feel that way. Like you have this autonomy, but you do get to choose your partner. And so I highly recommend this person just like acknowledge that your needs and your wants and your desires and your mental health deserve to be honored. And regardless of what you've been taught or led to believe, if you're not feeling good in this relationship, it doesn't even have to be abusive. If you're not feeling seen, heard, safe, respected, comfortable, you deserve to consider other alternatives because this isn't, I mean, we only live one life, right? Or we only know what we have right in front of us. And if we're like, I don't know, I always say, like, if this was your last day on earth, like, would you want to live like this? And I don't think it sounds like you don't feel like you want to live this way.
Yeah, no. I mean, and I think there's a lot of layers to this,
Yeah.
right? But I also like when you pointed out like her father was emotionally abusive, uh, our nervous system will gravitate to what
Hmm.
we know.
Hmm.
And especially, right, the other like compounding factor of being raised in a religion that tells you to gravitate to what you know.
Yeah.
know. But I love how so much of what you shared just really was about for her and her tuning in to her own
Yeah.
being and her own
Yeah.
soul and what is serving her,
And
kind
I
of
was like,
quieting some of that noise too.
yeah,
Oh,
exactly. Exactly. And that's part of my book is like tuning out that noise, like dialing it down. All the influences, all the feedback you're getting, all like the peanut gallery, like tuning all that down and really focusing on your inner experience. And I think I'm probably gonna repeat myself a lot, but that's so important. I was also gonna say, if you've been in a relationship for 20 years, you, I should have mentioned this at the beginning too, like with emotional abuse, there's a pattern, right? It's not one instance of abuse. It's systematic, it's long term, it persists. And even if there's some let up, because that happens a lot in emotionally abusive relationships, especially once you suggest to this partner you're going to leave, the abuse will subside or they will try to win you over. People might call this love bombing, but it's also like breadcrumbing, like I'm going to change, things will be better. They try to instill hope. So I think what's hard is sometimes the abuse will subside and there'll be periods without abuse or this partner will be on their best behavior. But if you've been in this relationship for 20 years, this person isn't changing, right? And it's I know like if you have a family with this person, that's a hard decision to make. So I don't want to say like take like I think too, it's not a matter to be taken lightly. And I know people can't just leave. It's not that simple. However, if you've been in this relationship for 20 years, we know that there's not going to be a difference in 5 years and 10 years.
No, I mean, I think that's so valid. And what comes up for me is like we have to trust patterns of behavior,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Okay, next submission. And I think this is this kind of leads into why it is so difficult to leave. What can happen to you physically and mentally if you choose to stay in an emotionally abusive relationship because you can't financially afford to leave?
Mm. Yeah. And this is, I actually recently had someone reach out through social media to be like, hey, like, and I appreciated that. And I said, like, thank you for your feedback. Essentially, it was like, it's not simple to leave. It's not as easy as, people make it sound. Absolutely not. And a part of a lot of relationships, especially like emotionally abusive ones or psychologically abusive ones, is the use of financial abuse or making your partner physically dependent on you. So you really have no way out. So that's a huge aspect of abusive relationships too, is creating financial dependence or limiting how many resources you have. That can be through isolating as well, or not letting you work or not letting you pursue it like a career, right? Like they want to create a dependence. So it isn't easy. And what I will say is try to build a support system if you have one, cue them in on what's going on, the and really focus on building that. And then I would also say, like, I think with people you love, family you love, if they know what's going on, kind of coming up with a plan of how to like start saving or finding ways to create like a I don't know, someone like a pot of money, right? Like for your leaving or just talking to people. Can I stay at your house? Can I crash at your house? You know what I mean? Finding ways to do that. I think too, it's core, like it depends. It varies. Like if there's an abusive, if it's physically abusive and there's domestic violence, that's a whole nother layer. Well, you might have to coordinate with family. You might have to have someone come and pick you up and like have another body there. But it isn't easy. So really it's about planning. It's about building up your support. It's about connecting to resources like domestic violence resources. A lot of these programs and like companies or nonprofits um, recognize the risks with leaving these dynamics. So they'll like when you go online, they will have like when you call, it won't say like domestic violence. Like they do it in ways so that if your abuser were to find you seeking out support, it's done in a way that's more confidential and anonymous, which I really appreciate. So there are a lot of domestic violence resources, like the hotline.org is a really big one. So making sure to connect to those resources when you can. And I will say, like, really, I would say building up your support system and looping people in. Like you don't even have to go into all the details, but letting people know you're in a bad situation and finding like brainstorming ways that they can be supportive of you trying to exit this relationship.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that's really coming up for me is I think about just the population here in Utah, and
Yeah.
so many women get married very young, have children very young, don't have careers, right? And so when I think in a lot of ways they are completely financially dependent on
Yeah.
their partner. And then the other layer of that is a lot of their family members are
Hmm.
and this again, this does not apply to all family members in this culture, but a lot of family members are really encouraging them, and the church is encouraging them to work it out with the
Yeah.
husband because of the sacredness of
Right.
marriage. And so it just adds another complication to this.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of pointing out some resources that are not even a part of the family system or a
Hmm.
part of the church,
Hmm.
because I would imagine for a lot of women listening, they might feel really isolated in that,
Yeah.
like, that their support system wouldn't even support them in
Right.
making this exit.
Or those support people are in similar situations, right? And are
Exactly.
of a similar belief system, right? No, it makes sense. And again, like this is like it's so much more complicated. It's not, and you can't. There's no easy exit. But I do think even like connecting with a therapist and talking about all your options you have, as far as even like I don't know, taking your kid to an after school program so you can do some work yourself, right? Like there are things that you can do just to build your support beyond family. And it takes time. I know it's not like something you can do in a day, But I really think building the support out, again, like outside of your family is going to be huge.
Yeah, no, and I just love that we're really making it clear that this is so much easier said than done. But I do agree that it starting just with taking care of yourself. So I have several clients who are in this situation, and the
Hmm.
place that we start is their relationship with themselves, right?
Hmm.
And just really tuning into their own needs and kind of creating some boundaries in that, right?
Hmm.
Because if you are so depleted and so out of touch with yourself, you're not going to have the fuel or the energy to start to negotiate what this is going to look like for you.
Right. Yeah.
All right. I'm just like, I'm so excited for this episode. It's like just such, so much expertise and information. So we're gonna keep going. Thank you, Leah. I just have to say that. Okay. Next submission. My mother-in-law will not let go of the fact that I don't speak to my mom or dad due to their emotional abuse. She just doesn't understand what they put me through while growing up and now as an adult. I feel like I've tried to explain my feelings to her many times, but she just doesn't understand. She continues to pray for them and bring them up and ask me when I will speak to them and how good it will be for me to talk with them again. She even has brought up how strong people are who break the cycle, but won't acknowledge that that is what I'm doing. How do I explain to her how they make me feel and how it makes me feel when she keeps bringing up the very people that hurt me? So it's interesting what comes up for me initially. And you could add to this, Leah, as
Hmm.
I am like, oh my gosh, this mother-in-law is very activated by your decision to have some distance from your parents. And
Hmm.
that makes me curious about how does the mother-in-law see herself and
Yeah.
the role she's had in her relationship with her kids, because she can't even reconcile that her kids could do this to her. I don't know. That's what initially came up for me when I
Yeah.
read this.
Well, and I was going to say, which is, this is sad, but a sad reality is I don't think we can get her to change her mind, right? Like she
Yes.
has dug her heels in. This is her belief. This is her expectation. You maintain, like, blood is blood, family is family. You maintain contact with your parents. You respect your parents. Your parents did so much. Everyone's flawed. Like I hear it all. And so I think unfortunately, like accepting, like this radical acceptance that this is her perspective and we can't change how she sees your decision making and your decision to not have a relationship with your parents. And that, again, easier said than done. But I think once you let go of the need to change her mind, to explain yourself, for her to see your perspective, even if it still is uncomfortable, it gives you relief knowing you don't have to like fight to
Yeah.
explain and have your experience validated. Um, I was also going to say, and it's like, it's with in-laws, it's different, but like, well, just even saying like my family's off the table, like, you know, we've had this discussion multiple times. I hear you. I see your perspective. I'm going to respectfully ask that we just stop talking about my family. And there may be pushback and she may push this boundary. And depending on your situation, I would say, talk to your spouse, like, okay, like, can we both be like in agreement that if she brings it up, I'm allowed to leave, or like, you know what I mean? Take
Yeah.
space. So you set this boundary of like, hey, I know, and you could do it in a kind way. Like, I know you're concerned. I hear you. I see that this upsets you, but we're not getting anywhere. And I'm going to ask that we just don't talk about this anymore. Or if things change, I always say this too. If things change, I will tell you. You'll be the first person to know, even if they aren't. If things change with my dynamic and my relationships, I will inform you. You will know. Like, and kind of just setting that expectation.
No, I love those boundaries and those scripts that you're offering. And I think too, right, again, highly unlikely that she is we can't, there's nothing that this person can do to make her mother-in-law understand. And I
No.
think it's super important to identify that. And then I would just encourage you just to let her to, work with your own dysregulation and activation around this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is something you do have the ability to tune into and
Yeah.
work through so that you can
Yeah.
feel more regulated when you are with your mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And I think it does start with that separation of
Yeah.
she feels what she wants to feel and you're not going to change her mind. And when you can accept that, then it gives you it empowers you to work with just your own dysregulation around it. And what comes up for me too is I'm sure that this has been really difficult to separate yourself from your parents.
Mhm.
Right. And so
Mhm.
and I'm sure you feel a little insecure about that, rightfully so. And that is what I would encourage you to dive more into and work through. And
Mhm.
you don't need your mother-in-law to see you in order to feel content with your choices and decisions.
Absolutely. No, that was beautifully said.
Okay, next submission. I had an emotionally abusive slash spiritually abusive partner for 3 years. I struggle to say that out loud and often find myself invalidating the abuse I experienced. I think it's because I don't want to see myself as a victim. Any recommendations on how to be more open to accepting that I was abused and that I can heal from that?
Well, and so I hear that because I think it's hard to use the word abuse or victim or abusive when talking about your own relationship or partner. Um, and you don't even necessarily have to use that language, but I don't know this person's age or like if they have children or the current circumstances, but something I would always encourage is self-compassion, and you can do this through like imagine that your best friend was in the same situation. Would do you feel like she should be ashamed of being in this relationship? What would you say to this person? And using that same script with yourself. Because we are a lot kinder to our loved ones, to our friends, to our children than to ourselves. So really kind of like pausing and asking yourself, how would you speak to someone you love who is in a dynamic that's similar? Um, and I think too, recognizing that these relationships are so complex and that I've seen all different people from all walks of life in abusive dynamics. Like it doesn't discriminate. So it's not about your intelligence, it's not about your ability to take care of yourself. It just happens. And the good news is you no longer have to be in this relationship if you choose, or you can learn, okay, this is not what I want for myself. And I'm not going to ever get into a similar situation in the future. And I'm going to be more protective of myself and not in a shaming way, but like, okay, I'm taking this information and I'm going to do things differently. So I think the practice of self compassion and just holding space for like yourself to feel how you feel, to like normalize your experience, to offer loving, kind words that you would give to anyone else you care about. And then just this idea of like, I'm going to protect myself moving forward. I learned from this experience, and I'm not saying it's meant to, I don't hate the kind of like, right. What is it? I just saw a post on it and thought it was brilliant. It was like, everything happens for a reason, or like, what did you learn? I don't love that, but I'm saying, how can I use this to improve my life moving forward or do something different moving forward? And I'm going to be more protective of myself. Like I'm going to be my own protector moving forward and kind of using it to empower you. I don't know if you're familiar with Kristen Neff, the self-compassion author, but she has this new book, Fear Self-Compassion, kind of talks about this, like being a protector for yourself and using compassion in a way that's protective. So it's not just soft, but it's like, I'm going to be protective, never going to let this happen to me ever again.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's so important too, right? Because I think in order to move through this, we have to acknowledge and take stock of what happened. And we
Hmm.
live in a world where so much is compared, right? Like, oh, well, you experienced this and this was far worse than what I experienced. And I really invite people to let that comparative suffering go because
Hmm.
what was distressful to you was distressful to you. And
Right.
even if you didn't like Leah, if Leah and I had two distressing experiences and they were different, one does not invalidate the other,
Exactly.
right? And it's such a subjective thing. So like, how did this relationship show up in your nervous system? How did it impact you? And all of those feelings are valid. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that and see
Hmm.
that. And that
Hmm.
actually doesn't make you a victim. That empowers you to take responsibility for how this distress is showing up in your life.
Hmm.
And I think we have to have that relationship and that self compassion.
Totally. And I would say like another thing, and I know like, as a therapist, all my clients, their experiences are confidential, but what I do share with clients is like, you don't know how many people I see that are in a very similar situation. So like if I think they say, I don't know the percentage right now is that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people like will experience abuse, right? Or an abusive relationship. But if that's the case, like so many people, and that's probably honestly, like a what is it? What my brain this morning? That probably is I would say it's higher. And because again, like abuse looks different. A lot of people don't know they're being abused. They just know that they're miserable and that this relationship has made them feel so small, right? So it's so common. And I just think acknowledging that you are not alone in this and so many people go through this is going to be so helpful for your healing. Because I promise you're not alone. There are so many people who have had similar experiences and it's awful, but it's unfortunately like so common because of our culture and how we've perpetuated, right? This culture of abuse, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, that's what was also coming up for me while you were just talking is like people don't know how to have these healthy relationship dynamics because it's never been modeled or taught. I mean, we don't learn about
No.
it. Us as therapists, I mean, you even shared this earlier, Leah, like you were like, I have the knowledge and I still within this type of relationship,
Yep. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's so incredibly true because we are just doing what we've been taught to do or what we've seen. And no,
Mm-hmm.
not very many of us grew up in homes that one modeled probably really healthy relationship dynamics because generationally that wasn't our
Mm-hmm.
parents' experiences. And so this is vast for a lot of reasons. And I think it also means that you're not alone and that things can shift and change. So
Yeah. One thing I was thinking as you're speaking too is I think understanding coercion and the use of coercion in relationships is going to be so helpful because happens so gradually where you don't know you're in it. So it's not like you allow this person to walk all over you. Like there was, again, like a systematic pattern of behavior that got you to submit or to kind of like appease this person. And I think that piece is so important because it happens so gradually. It's not like someone, again, like you go on a date, you're on a dating app, you meet someone and they're like, "Hey, do you want to be in a relationship where I abuse you and treat you like shit?" Like you don't ever go into it that way. So I think the coercive control, the coercion piece is so important to understand and recognize. Because I was going to say with coercion too, it's like, well, what I experienced too is really leading with empathy with this person who I know was hurting. Because I will say this as well, and I don't know if this is in the questions, and we might duplicate this, but abusive partners are not always narcissists. Like they're hurt people that
Mhm.
have unhealed trauma themselves, and I'm not justifying their behavior. It's
No.
absolutely not justifiable. But I think what got me stuck in this relationship, in this dynamic, was knowing the trauma history, especially as a therapist, like knowing all the attachment stuff, being like, oh, this person's clearly hurting, right? And so I led with empathy versus being like, no, I don't have to lead with empathy. I can absolutely have a boundary, hold this person accountable, and leave this relationship despite their shit. Do you cuss on this? I didn't even ask
No,
you.
yeah, you can cuss.
Okay.
This is a safe space to say whatever you want and show up
I
as
just
you
realized that
are.
after I cussed a couple times, but I think too, like I think things are so nuanced. Coercion is so nuanced. It's like there's different ways of coercion, but empathy is a huge one, right? So if you are under the belief that I'm this person's sole person, like I am their go-to person, I don't want to leave them. Where are they going to go? How are they going to function? Like that's so common too. So recognizing how these aspects of the relationship might be playing into it because it's so manipulative. I always say it's like a two-person cult. Like these relationships, you're essentially brainwashed, right? Into believing like I have to say I don't have other choices or like I don't deserve better or I need to be here for this person. And so a lot of it's like recognizing like, oh, like my reality actually isn't the reality. This reality has been imposed on me by this person. So I think too that can maybe help with the compassion piece of recognizing those coercive aspects of relationships.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is like really helpful information and it encourages people to tune in a lot of different ways. And I mean, self-compassion is such an important place to
Mm-hmm.
start. And
Mm-hmm.
then also recognizing when we have so much compassion for our partners, that can also keep us stuck in these
Yeah.
dynamics.
Yeah.
Um, okay, this is a little bit of a longer one, but so I'm going to read it. I like kind of when we have the opportunities to dissect something with more context.
Mm-hmm.
So, experienced emotional abuse throughout my upbringing and then later in my marriage, among other types of abuse. I wish people who haven't experienced it could understand just how damaging it is and how virtually impossible it is to escape from and heal from. Trying to co-parent with your abuser is its own category of hell, and any future relationship experiences will be forever tainted by the fear of the same thing happening again. After all, your abuser once was someone you trusted and loved. One of the most challenging aspects is that the abuser tries to convince you that you are the one committing the abuse.
Mhm.
How can you tell if your behaviors are abusive versus mere reactions to the abuse? Is there a difference? For example, whenever my ex and I had a disagreement, I would start yelling at him. But whenever I purposely stayed calm, he would not grasp the urgency of my message and would simply dismiss my needs. He would ignore them regardless, but at least by yelling at him, I could force him to acknowledge my attempt at communicating those needs. How can you heal from emotional abuse? Obviously, there's lots of layers here. So I'm curious your insights, Leah.
The first thing I was thinking about is I hate the term reactive abuse, and I actually didn't know that it was a term until recently when someone asked me about reactive abuse, being like, is I like essentially this they were saying I engage in reactive abuse. Like I am also abusive towards my abusive partner. And I don't love that because when we're, you know, shoved like when we're shoved against the wall, we don't feel like we have any out, when we feel like we're not being heard, when we're feeling like we're not safe, we are going to do whatever it takes to feel heard, to feel safe, to protect ourselves, right? And while it may feel extreme, because it probably is, you're protecting yourself. Like if staying calm, like, being regulated has not worked because this person, I mean, essentially they won't listen to you. Like it's kind of like a kid, right? Like if you don't feel heard, you just like kick and scream and push and shove and like it's because you don't feel heard. So I don't think that that's abusive. I think that's self-preservation. I don't think it's effective because we learned, like, right, like with these abusive partners, there's really no way of changing their behavior or getting them to see your perspective. But you don't know that in the moment. So you are reacting from this like fight, flight, freeze. Your body's like in that mode and you need to protect yourself and you need to feel heard. And I feel like most people can say like they've just like they don't feel like they have any other options. So they escalate because they don't know what else will work. Or if someone's, like again, like posturing or being physically aggressive, like you're going to push back sometimes. Like that's natural and that's not abusive.
Yeah.
That's
No,
self-defense.
what's coming up for me too is as you were talking and as I read
Yeah.
this, you're in fight or flight,
Yeah.
right? That's what's happening. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Leah, because this is not my expertise, but a lot of times in these emotionally abusive relationships, the emotionally abusive partner will make you feel like you are the abuser.
Yes. Yep. I've heard like, yes, it's like they'll say, you're the narcissist, you're immature, you're too much, you're asking for a lot. Like it's and that's a way to deflect, right? That's manipulative too. So it's like they will blame you and point fingers, and that's coercive too. Because really they want to change how you see things and your reality so that you essentially accept their behaviors as being acceptable, right? So if
Yeah.
you think that that if they've made you to believe that you're being abusive, like you are more likely to tolerate their own behaviors. Or like another example is like, they said like, you know, if you would have been ready earlier, I wouldn't have yelled at you or I wouldn't have like called you that name. Right. And so then when they point fingers and deflect, you take on the blame and responsibility. And again, it makes those behaviors permissible and excusable. So it's a lot of it's mind fuckery is what I call it. Like it's really,
Yeah.
really
No.
manipulative. It's brainwashing really. And so, um, you like for this question, someone raising their voice, it's not abusive. You're in a situation that's like lose-lose. You're not going to come out of this situation feeling heard. But if you've tried so many times to do it in a calm, mature way and it hasn't been received, of course you're going to go to the next step of yelling, raising your voice, right? That's natural.
No, yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to point that out. And I guess I kind of want to, I know we've talked, and we've touched on healing and how to navigate that, but like
Mhm.
in this person specific situation, right? It seems like there's it's been there's been a lot packed into this. And, um, one of the lines that they shared was that, um, it feels virtually impossible to escape from and heal from.
Hmm.
And I'm curious, where would you invite them to start their healing journey? Just kind of knowing a little bit more about where they're at.
So I think a big part is recognizing the beliefs that, like the core beliefs that are an outcome of these experiences. And from this question, it sounds like there was abuse during childhood, right? So there may have been negative core beliefs earlier on that were then reinforced in this abusive dynamic. So really take an inventory of the negative core beliefs and recognizing where they came from. And like really having that, like, kind of, I call it like deconstructing your thoughts, like this idea of like, okay, where is this belief I'm not good enough come from? Was it from this partner? Was it from my dad? And just being curious and understanding where these beliefs come from, and having this I guess approach of like, is it possible that these beliefs are not true, and that there is trauma underlying these beliefs or experiences that I've not yet fully processed that have led me to think this about myself? Because I think the thing is once you're able to challenge and um dispute these negative core beliefs and identify more adaptive beliefs that are more, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like reflective of what the reality is, like you start to feel more empowered. I guess that makes sense. So I think too, like just recognizing, this relationship made you feel not good enough. Again, like the self-compassion piece. Like, what would I tell this friend if they were in a situation? Would you say, yeah, you're not good enough? You deserve the abuse? No, you'd be like, this person treated you like shit. You deserved so much better. You didn't know better because of your childhood, right? You'd be so much more
Yeah.
affirming and compassionate. And so, really identifying these beliefs and trying to work through them is a huge, like, first step, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what's also coming up for me that I would add is, right, trauma. And I'm using the word trauma because there's so many layers to this, right?
Hmm.
And that amount of distress gets stored in the body. And so
Hmm.
there are some things we can't actually cognitively talk ourselves out of.
Right.
And I would invite this person to consider like a nervous system, a body-based approach like EMDR, like brain spotting. I mean, there's so many different things out there, but to allow them to understand again on a nervous system level where some of these core beliefs are coming from.
Hmm.
Because
And
yeah,
go
no,
ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that. No, and I agree because I think you're right. Like you can't. I mean, that's part of the reason too. When you're reacting, you can't. You're not thinking this person is being completely unreasonable. I cannot rationalize with this person. You don't have that capacity because you're in fight or flight. So that's absolutely. So I think that stabilization is super important. I also think like I guess rediscover like reacquainting yourself with yourself, like reconnecting to who you are. And some people in these dynamics, or if they've experienced chronic abuse throughout their lives, like don't know who they are. So really starting that exploratory, like discovery phase of like, what do I like? What do I not like? What makes me feel good? What makes me feel bad? What do I prefer? Do I like this? Like, my husband always said I like that. Do I really like that? Like really starting to tease out what you like and coming into like your own
Hmm.
identity outside of your partner, outside of your trauma, and really starting to explore that. Because once you start to feel more connected to who you are, you start feeling more grounded and you feel more confident and you feel more self assured. And so that's the other thing too, is like it's hard and I think can feel really overwhelming because a lot of people feel lost after they leave a relationship. Like, who am I? Where did I
Yeah.
go?
Yeah.
So, really like exploring that and knowing it's a process. You don't have to know right away. But like, I've had a couple clients, it's like they've like ended these relationships and they're like, my partner never liked, this hand soap. So now I get to use this hand soap. Like I get to use this one. Like I love this one. Or like, my partner um never liked like these shows. So I'm going to watch these shows and I'm going to binge watch these shows and know that there's no repercussions. Nobody will yell at me or criticize me. So like really like leaning into that. Like what are some of the things that I gravitate towards, and like how can, I don't know, just in exploring that, like are these things bringing me joy, and if they are, great, and really celebrating that.
Oh yeah, I love all of this. And I kind of want to continue the healing conversation with this next question.
Yeah.
It says, I guess I'm still healing in that I still don't think I'm worth anything after years of gaslighting and always being told things were my fault. How can I learn to trust myself again? And I think this really kind of connects to everything you just and
Yeah.
we just kind of discussed.
Yeah. So it's I always say it's a process, right? So I think to A, have like very realistic expectations and know that it's not going to happen overnight. I think that's a big part because I think too, other people who have not been in these dynamics think leaving the relationship is like it's one and done. Like it's you're good. But there's so much trauma and attachment trauma from these relationships that it takes a while to heal. So I think just having realistic expectations for yourself is I think crucial because I do think people are hard on themselves. They're like, I'm out of this relationship. Shouldn't I feel better? Shouldn't I be better? And there's this expectation that life will just like be, like rainbows and butterflies once you've left this relationship. But there's so much harm done. And again, like there's a lot of brainwashing. So there's a lot of deprogramming you have to do and you have to like rebuild yourself up and you have to like work on building your self-worth and self-esteem. And this takes time. So I think like we said, like some of these modalities are really helpful if you have access to a therapist who is trauma informed and can use these modalities with you. I always say like building a support system. So if you're isolated, really focusing on building it. And even it could be like reconnecting to people maybe you disconnected with. It could be like, like if you're immersed in this culture community that's been oppressive, you're like, okay, I'm going to try something different. Like I'm going to go to like, I mean, this is silly, but like I'm going to go to this like workout class and like that's completely not like tied to my community or something. Or I'm going to, I don't know, like try pottery. Like it seems silly, but doing these things that help you create a support system is huge too. Cause I think even if you have community, if they're oppressive, that's not your community.
Yeah, no, I love what you're sharing here because to me, healing is very intentional. And that's why
Yeah.
it's hard,
Yeah.
right? It
Yeah.
is so hard to choose to intentionally work through your own wounds and the things that you've endured and experienced in your life. And it is
Yeah.
very uncomfortable. And that, like working with that discomfort can be trying something new, like going to a pottery class or going to
Yeah.
a workout class you've never gone to and starting to build relationships and communities that
Mm-hmm.
are necessary in a lot of ways to creating a support system outside of the abusive relationship,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it is very uncomfortable and that's normal.
I think that's why a lot of people stay, right? Because it feels like so daunting and like so
Yes.
much work. And that's where a lot of work I do with folks that are still in the relationship where they're still like contemplative. They're like, I know it's not good for me. I know it's not great, but like, what will life look after this relationship? Like, even if I feel better emotionally or feel safer, I don't have like this partner. I don't have my like family unit that I like, you know what I mean? So it's like, there's a lot of like, and I was going to say, there's a lot of grief comes with leaving these relationships too. And so a lot of work I do with clients too is like really holding space for that grief because you might grieve the partner. I know it sounds wild, but you might grieve this partner, like this person you thought they were, the things that they did that you did like you might grieve this partner, you might grieve the family unit you had with them, like right, this nuclear family that no longer is nuclear because you're separated and you have to, right? Like there's so many aspects too of grief that you have to work through. So I think kind of going back to like taking your time and holding space for that is going to be so important. I think sometimes also grief is delayed, so you might not feel it till like a few months out of the relationship, but
Yeah.
grief is so important to like honor. And I think people don't really see leaving a relationship that's abusive as needing to grieve it, but it's so important.
Yeah, no, I actually really love that you share that. And I was, so I've also been in an emotionally abusive relationship and I was early. It was like right when I was in graduate school, learning to become a therapist, right? And I would say that I still grieve and I'm married, I have kids, right? I'm like completely moved on from this relationship, but there was a reason why I was in this relationship, why I loved
Mm-hmm.
this partner. And there are times where I still grieve it because I think that's normal and
Mm-hmm.
part of healing, right? And I part of the reason why I stayed is because I loved his family. So this was the first person I ever dated that was not part of the LDS church, right? So didn't
Okay.
have like this
Like the
religious
ties.
upbringing. And I remember very early on, I was like 2 or 3 months into dating. And like something happened. I was in college, right? And I had been out with my friends and I didn't text him
Mm.
to let him know I was home safe. And he lost it. Like he lost it on me. And to this day, like I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is such a red flag. No, 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 you don't do this. But
Yeah.
I stayed because
Yeah.
I think there was other reasons that were pulling me to him.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, so from that time, then that dynamic continued for like the next 2 years that we dated
Mm-hmm.
on, and we were kind of on and off for a while. But I loved his family, and they were so different than my family, and they had such different experiences. And he had a brother that was because he was a little bit older, and he had a brother my age, and his brother's girlfriend, and they're now married. And it was such a huge loss to lose his
Yeah.
parents and to lose them, because they had become a support system for me in Southern California. And again, to this day, that grief will still bubble up, and I just hold space for it. And I am in my current partner, my husband is just really incredible. And we talk about it. We talk about
Mm-hmm.
how we've loved other people in our life, and we've had these
Mm-hmm.
meaningful relationships, and the safety of my relationship with my husband, I think, has allowed me to move through some of the things I
Mm-hmm.
experienced. But I also share this to, again, really normalize that so many of us have been in
Yeah.
emotionally abusive relationships. And I wouldn't even label this person as narcissistic or anything like that. And I
No.
think, and if I saw him, I would give him a hug, right? Like, he was who he was because of his own traumas and his own experiences, but
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean I should stay,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
just because he has a wonderful family doesn't mean I should have stayed.
Right.
But they also played a significant role in my life and who I am. And I think it's really about holding space for both of those things. And I think
Mm-hmm.
this also applies to, and while you were talking, Leah, I was thinking about staying in a high control religion, and
Yeah.
how a lot of times staying in the church is easier than leaving,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
for all of these different things. And there is such a huge part of grief, because you are going to grieve what you left behind, even if there were harmful, hurtful parts. And so much of healing is holding space for
Mm-hmm.
both of these things, allowing both of these things to be true. And that's really
Mm-hmm.
difficult to do.
It is. And I think too, a lot of people feel like it's weak, right? Like if you miss this
Yes.
part or aspect of the relationship, or you are still like, you still think of them or parts of them or their family or whatever fondly, it's like, I'm weak or something's wrong with me. But I don't think it's that simple. Things are so much more layered, and like that duality, right? Like holding both truths is so important. And I think that's like a lot of the work I do too. It's like, is it possible? Like what's so wrong about that of holding truths? A lot of times it's like their own shame or a judgment of others, but at the end of the day, it's your life and your experience, and only you've lived this life. So you get to decide like that these things are both true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, this healing conversation, I think, is really, really, really powerful. I do want to do one more question, because
Yeah.
I think it's a super important one, and
Okay.
it's kind of one that I think a lot of people are definitely navigating, just because in the modern world. Um, and then I still have other questions we didn't get to, so maybe we can have you back for a part two.
Yeah.
So I just am so curious your insights on this one. My spouse thinks that knowing each other's phone passwords and having full access to them is part of being in a trustworthy and transparent relationship. This is after he has taken my phone before and gone through it after he claims he had a feeling he needed to. My trust was broken that he would go through my stuff without asking. I had nothing to hide. Am I in the wrong to now not tell him my password?
No, I don't think you're in the wrong at all. Oh God. I know. And like there's still folks that like share, they actually have like a mutual like social media page. Like they share their Instagram. Like there's like what's hard is, okay, so they're like more traditional or like ideologies of what it means to be in a relationship, right? Where like you are each other's other half, and you're one, and you share everything, and there are no secrets there. And while transparency, openness, communication's all important, I guess it's hard. So, if that's something that you value too, sharing phones that you like, that you're like, I like this, great. But if which what I'm hearing by this question, you don't like it. So, if it doesn't feel good for you and you value your autonomy and having just like this thing that's yours, right? That's not secretive, it's just yours. That's absolutely fair. Um, I think like, and I talk about this too with a lot of folks is like, for example, traditional gender roles, right? Like if your partner wants you to be the stay-at-home parent, to be to be this domestic partner who takes care of the home, raises the kids while they bring home the money and they work and that's also your ideology and what you want, not what you were taught you want, then that's like it can be copacetic, right? Because you're both on the same page, you value the same things. Um, your responsibilities are mutually agreed upon. I think in situations where like kind of the share, like one person has the expectation of sharing all these passwords, of like being able to like essentially like, I guess, check, audit one's phone and things, and that doesn't align with you, then that's not good for you. And I
Mhm.
don't think that even means that your partner is bad necessarily, but clearly there's some trust stuff there. So
Yep.
I think it's like there's something like the cell phone's at the tip of the iceberg is what I would say. And there's other foundational stuff to work on with your partner if they are a safe partner, right? Like where you're like, "Hey, like what's going on that you feel this impulse to check my phone?" So I think the thing is like everything needs to be shared and mutually agreed upon. Shared meaning like expectations and responsibilities, and otherwise it's not fair, and it can be imbalanced and it can lead to an abusive dynamic or a power and control dynamic. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm very long-winded.
No, no, that I loved. There was a couple things I really loved. I loved the iceberg metaphor. Like
Yeah.
to me, this is the tip of the iceberg. And what's coming
Yeah.
up for me is what are his insecurities? What are his trust stuff?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Why does this have to be something that exists in the relationship?
Right.
And I love what you talked about things being mutually agreed upon.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's so interesting because what comes up for me too is I have my husband and I can get into each other's phones, but I think our reasons are very different.
Right.
Right. And it is like this mutually agreed upon thing where I need to be able to get in his phone sometime to like get some stuff and vice versa.
Right.
Right. And I have this trust and respect for him he's not going to go through my stuff because he doesn't need to, because he's secure enough within
Right.
himself to not need to know all the things that I'm doing on my phone. Right. And vice
Right.
versa. And I think that becomes a different scenario than what
Totally.
we're reading about right here.
Yeah.
And to me, that goes on to both partners in the relationship to do their own work around what makes them feel secure and safe, right? And not
Mm-hmm.
be pressured to we don't need to be going through each other's phones.
No. And like I don't necessarily like it's another again another there is some like controlling aspects of that. And I'm not even saying that's going to be like this is something you can't work through, but like with like teens, we would call that like technology abuse, right? Where you like
Yes.
are like, I have your login for your Instagram account, your TikTok, I get to see who you're DMing. Like there's like this they very and it's used to really track and to keep tabs on your partner and really honestly like have authority over what they do, with who they talk to, who they're friends with, and that is problematic. So I do think like right, exactly. Like they're, like my partner like will give me his password, so I'll log in to his like to take a picture, whatever, to like to log
Yes.
into Yelp, whatever it is. And things are it makes sense, but I think the intention, right, is not to be investigative and to like it's not assuming I'm doing anything wrong. It's like we use each other's phones when it's appropriate, when it's needed, but it's not as a means of like infringing on the other person's autonomy.
No, yes. And I think also too, and we've talked a lot about this today, tuning into how it feels
Yeah.
in your body, right?
Yeah.
And if he's asking to have your passwords, how does that feel?
Mhm.
What comes up for you?
Like, do you feel violated?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that is such a good measure to kind of reflect on a lot of these things and so much of what we talked about. And I think, Leah, we could probably talk for hours and hours,
Yeah.
and I could pick your brain for hours and hours. I genuinely love your content so much. And
I love yours. I've been telling Ashley I wanted to write a book, so I'll be
maybe
working
one
on
day
that.
if I ever write a book, I will be connecting to Leah about it. Thank you so much for just sharing your expertise with us today. I think I don't even think I know it's going to be so helpful for many listeners, and I cannot wait to share this episode. I always end with this. Is there anything else that you would like to share or say or end with on your end?
Oh, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
We did. We did. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have any additional questions, please use the link in the show notes, and hopefully we'll have Leah on here again soon. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If today's content resonated with you, please share, leave a review, all the things. It would mean so much to me.